Well, it's a special time for us as we're finally getting a new series of Inside Number 9, which can only mean one thing: watching 6 tales from the minds of Steve Pemberton and Reece Shearsmith and still thinking about them the week after they air. But what does the new Series 7 have in store for us? Well, each week I'll be going through each episode and giving my analysis and general thoughts on them. I did try to do this previously with Series 6 without a script, but yeah, they weren't that good. So now I think it's time to improve on my work and my analysis on this wonderful show. So without further ado, welcome everybody to my review of this episode from Inside Number 9, Series 7. Okay, so a bit of backstory before we get into today's episode. Usually in a series of Inside Number 9, there'll be a certain few episodes that always prop up, those being the domestics, the horror pieces, and the special episodes, aka the episodes which are presented and told differently when compared to others. For Series 7, there was no strict special episode per se, but there was one specific episode that used the special format that I'm pretty sure everybody was excited for back when they first saw the trailer. I am by no means exempt from this, and as the weeks went by, at the back of our minds, we were all thinking about the one final episode that was to come to the end of the series. It could have been the best episode, it could have been the worst episode, it could have just been middling. So, with that being said, does Wise Owl live up to its immediate hype? For this episode, we're introduced to the Wise Owl public information films, which ran from the late 70s to early 80s and dealt with standard matters like don't climb up pylons, don't talk to strangers, and all that jazz, all taught by the eponymous Wise Owl. However, intercut these films, we follow a man named Ronnie, who acts very strangely in his house full of retro wallpaper and taxidermied animals, while still keeping in mind the teachings of the Wise Owl films he saw as a child. But as the episode progresses, the audience is allowed to dig deeper into Ronnie's mental state and see what truly motivates his behaviour. First things first, we gotta talk about the elephant in the room regarding the episode, which are the animated segments. These short little clips provide a sense of levity and intrigue to the audience, and it makes them think about where exactly the plot is going toward and if these films are a part of a bigger puzzle, which they eventually are revealed to be. But aside from that, the animation done by Sam O'Leary for the episode manages to toe the line between charming and unnerving, and fits in line with other PSIs, most notably the Charlie Says series, which has obviously inspired them. This design even extends to the Wise Owl himself, played by Ron Cook, whose voice and design did a good job at unnerving the viewer.
Ooh, only a fool would climb up there. Didn't you see the warning sign? Pylons kill.
But there's an actual episode alongside these segments, so let's get into the actual plot. The general premise of the episode is completely focused around Ronnie, who exactly he is, why he behaves in such a strange manner, and what led him to where he is now. The character of Ronnie is such an interesting character in the Gents catalogue, and that's saying something, and Reece Shearsmith plays the role exceptionally, bringing in the usual brand of strangeness, snarkiness, and eventually pity to him. Ronnie seems to act and behave all in accordance to the teachings of the Wise Owl, and at the start, we as the audience can tell that there's clearly something up with him. His movements and general speaking patterns seem to exude an almost childlike persona to his character, especially in the few scenes where he's talking to his neighbour, Mr. Blenkin. And the character of Mr. Blenkin manages to provide some short-lived humour and levity to the episode, as we see a definite contrast between him and Ronnie, as he is quite talkative and relatively normal when they interact, even if it's only for him to give Ferrari to Ronnie and subsequently receive it back as a mangled experiment on how not to taxiderm a pet, despite the Wise Owl's instructions beforehand. That and Steve Pemberton manages to bring in quite a humorous performance, as he always does when he plays these types of characters on the show.
I don't need it all dressed up and doing ballet like a Beatrix Potter. You'll just be in a corner of the hutch covered in straw, you'll barely see it. It's just, we're not ready for the whole death conversation yet. We've got all that to come with my mother.
And the humour itself fits in quite well with the two Gents' traditional sense of comedy, drama, and horror, which comes in full circle with what the episode is truly about. And with that being said, I assume that if you're watching this review, you've likely seen the episode beforehand, so could I just say that Jesus Christ, was this one grim. Series 7 has had its fair share of dark and bleak moments in the previous episodes, but that was accompanied by a farcical nature beforehand or an ending straight out of The Wicker Man. Wise Owl, on the other hand, is easily the darkest this series is willing to go, and it may be one of the darkest in the entire show. In fact, when writing this script, I was debating whether or not to put a trigger warning beforehand, but since you've probably seen the episode before watching this, I decided not to go with it. The darkness is possibly hinted at the start when Ronnie brings electronics near his avocado-coloured bath, possibly in an attempt to kill himself, and is further hinted at by the several taxidermies plastered around the lounge. The eventual grim realisation of what is actually going on comes in at about 20 minutes in, and we are eventually given the reason as to why Ronnie seems to obsess over the Wise Owl. It's revealed that Ronnie's father was the voice actor for the Wise Owl, and that the animated PSIs sprinkled in are actually amalgamations of real Wise Owl PSIs and Ronnie's childhood memories. The boy and the girl in the films are actually Ronnie and his sister, which focus on her 6th birthday where a house fire starts and Ronnie blames himself for his sister's death during the accident. However, the plot then gets ramped up to 11 when Ronnie's dad, Wilf, enters the episode. It turns out that Ronnie had been squatting at his dad's house in preparation for the anniversary of his sister's death. It is then shown to the audience that Wilf is a heavy alcoholic and, while drunk, sexually abused Ronnie as a child using the Wise Owl character in order to have quote-unquote fun with him. However, during one of these moments, the accidental house fire starts, and Wilf, with a reputation on the line, decides to blame it all on Ronnie, leaving him to be raised in a psychiatric hospital for the rest of his supposed adolescence. Yeah, I warned you guys this will get dark. Now, these dark topics are no stranger to Inside Number 9. In fact, the first ever episode of the entire show, Sardines, also deals with the same themes of incest, molestation, and paedophilia, but whenever these topics do appear in any show, they have to be dealt with a certain sense of maturity. Just seemingly throwing these horrible, disgusting topics just for the sake of shock is never going to work. I read quite a few crappy creepypastas about Jeff the Killer ripoffs back in the day that tried and failed at being good stories, and usually one of the reasons why they didn't work was because they tackled these topics poorly. But fortunately, Steve and Reese are actually talented writers, so they are able to handle these in a mature and respectful way, so this never feels forced or like they're crossing a certain line. Throughout the episode, there's a sense of uneasiness that hangs over it, which isn't really helped by the fact that the final episode in the series of the show is usually a straight horror piece. This works because of multiple strong factors in the episode, like the writing obviously, but also the performances of not just Reese Shearsmith, but also everyone else, like Ronnie's mother, played by Georgie Glenn, who manages to further evoke sympathy from the audience towards Ronnie, and also Ron Cook, playing Ronnie's now taxidermist father, who perfectly plays arguably one of the most monstrous people to ever be written on this show, but also doing a good job with the calm and yet sinister voice of the Wise Owl. There's also other factors working in this episode's favour to make it as effective as possible, such as the score by the show's mainstay composer Christian Henson, and also the direction, which marks the return of Louise Hooper to the series, who you may remember for being the same person to direct Mr. King earlier on. She really brings in some interesting shots to the episode and even some effective lighting of dark blue light to further portray Ronnie's inner feelings of sadness and guilt, whether that be in the final few scenes or with Ronnie's nightmare with his naked owl-headed father, which I can't show because YouTube doesn't like on-screen cock and bollocks. Now that I think about it, Mr. King also had uncensored on-screen penises, and that was directed by Louise as well. Also, as a separate side note, I watched this episode live with my mum, and in hindsight, maybe that wasn't the best choice. But anyways, everything in this episode all culminates in its ending, and as dark as the subject matter for it is, it's surprisingly quite uplifting. The ending scene, and especially the final animated segment, show Ronnie grow and mature as a person. Wilf once again tries to play another game with his son, which may even be in his old childhood bedroom, but he refuses. As a boy, Ronnie was less likely to be taken seriously regarding his father's reputation and the general public environment in the late 70s, early 80s, but now he leaves his old childhood house in order to visit his mother and finally tell her about the abuse after several long decades. He rejects the control of his father and in turn, the Wise Owl. It's oddly strange that we don't have many happy endings in Inside Number 9, so having one in such a dark episode felt like the perfect way to end it. It's odd to think that this almost didn't make the final cut, as this was added by Louise Hooper later on, and I cannot be thankful enough for it.
Get stuffed.
Honestly, there is more I can talk about with this episode, but I'll save them for a later video regarding my thoughts on Series 7 as a whole. But to conclude this video, Wise Owl is a great piece of television and a definite highlight of not just this series, but the show as a whole. With some great performances all around and great writing and direction to complement it, Wise Owl is a dark and emotional episode with the gent's traditional sense of dark humour to create levity alongside it. So, to provide an answer to the question I proposed at the start of this review, yes, Wise Owl was definitely worth the hype.